Hi, Ryan Reynolds here for Mint Mobile. Are you looking for a beach read this summer? May I suggest your big wireless bill? It's got suspense, mystery, a slightly flat emotional arc, and a shocking twist where you realize you've been overpaying the entire time. Fortunately, though, Mint's story is better. Every plan, $15 a month. Even unlimited. That's it. Happy ending. Zero tears. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.
This is episode 432 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Lucy Munro. I'm a professor of Shakespeare and early modern literature at King's College London and the author of Shakespeare in the Theatre, The King's Men. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In Shakespeare's Henry IV Part 1, there's a lively scene set in Eastcheap inside the bustling Boar's Head Tavern, where the roguish Sir John Falstaff trades wit and wine with the young Prince Hal, England's future Henry V. To Shakespeare's audience, this wasn't some distant or imagined world. Eastcheap is a real place, and the taverns that they were setting the scene in, well, those are real too. And the cups of ale and small beer passed across those tables were the very same drinks many theatergoers would have enjoyed before walking into the Globe. This week, we're joined by Mark Hailwood, author of Alehouses and Good Fellowship in Early Modern England, to step through the tavern door and into the noisy, smoky world of 16th and 17th century alehouses. Together, we'll explore the people who ran these establishments, the customs and rules that governed them, the drinks that poured across the bar, and the colorful realities behind Shakespeare's tavern scenes. Was Mistress Quickly inspired by real alehouse keepers? How accurate were Shakespeare's depictions of tavern life? And what details from the plays ring true, or maybe delightfully false, when held up against the history of early modern England? Let's find out this week. So pull up a chair by the hearth, mind your purse, and let us pour you a mug of small beer as Mark Hailwood guides us through the history, humor, and lore of Shakespeare's tavern world. Before we get started today, remember that members of our show can access insider extras, including paintings, woodcuts, maps, and primary documents that illustrate what we're discussing. And you can scroll through all of it while you listen if you sign up to be a member of That Shakespeare Life at patreon.com/That Shakespeare Life. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Mark. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, Cassidy.
Who was it that actually owned the alehouses in the 16th century? Can you give us some examples of famous inns or taverns and who their real owners were?
Yeah, sure. One of the most famous examples would be the Mermaid Tavern, which was on Cheapside, and the Mermaid Tavern was attended by Ben Jonson and John Donne and other literary figures in the Elizabethan era. That was probably one of the most famous examples. There was a group of literary figures who would meet there supposedly on the first Friday of every month to drink wine, of course, but also to exchange material and to trade witty banter and play word games against each other. There's some speculation that Shakespeare himself might have been involved in these meetings in the Mermaid, although most scholars think that's wishful thinking and it's quite improbable that he was there. We do know the landlord of the Mermaid Tavern was a man called William Johnson, but we don't know very much about him. So there aren't really that many very famous owners of pubs in the 16th and 17th centuries. Most people that owned them were relatively humble individuals, ordinary men and women. It was a profession that was usually undertaken by the poorer sorts, or sometimes the middling sorts might run establishments as well. But there were certainly very large numbers of people who owned and ran drinking establishments in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was very common. Every village in England would have had at least one and probably more alehouses in their ranks. And their numbers were actually increasing in Shakespeare's lifetime. There was about 25,000 drinking establishments in England in 1550s, and there was double that many by the 1650s. So being an owner of an inn, an alehouse, or a tavern was actually quite a common and increasingly common occupation in the period. But it didn't create too many famous figures because it was a very kind of workaday profession for most people.
Is the character of Mistress Quickly analogous to a real person that would have been in charge of local alehouses?
I mean, as far as I'm aware, not a specific real person, but she was certainly true to a type that would have been very familiar to Shakespeare's audiences. The alewife was a very familiar figure in 16th century England. As I say, there were very significant numbers of alehouses. Everybody would have frequented a local alehouse. And although the licenses tended to be held by men, the vast majority of these alehouses were actually run by women. So licenses tended to go to men or to widows, but many of these married men who secured licenses were actually farmers, husbandmen farmers or tradesmen, and it was their wife who would actually do the running of the establishment. So in the character of Mistress Quickly, Shakespeare was very much using a type that would have been extremely familiar to all members of his audience. And the alewife had a very interesting and demanding role. I mean, she had to oversee the basics of running the establishments, serving the drink, often serving food, and providing lodging. She would have had servants to help her with some of those provisions, but she also had to maintain order, try and keep everybody well behaved. Making sure your alehouse was an orderly establishment was part of the licensing conditions. So if there was too much bad behavior, then you could have your license removed. So they had to be fairly strict, but on the other hand, they needed customers to keep coming back. So they had to be popular, and they had to cultivate a good repartee with their customers. And they had to have a good reputation for producing good beer as well to keep people coming back. So it wasn't an easy role at all.
Well, you're speaking about the orderly part of your licensing conditions. What were the rules of behavior inside an alehouse or tavern? Were they, loud, unruly places, generally speaking, or were they more like what we would think of as a restaurant today, where, everybody sits and behaves?
I mean, in some ways they were a bit of both. I think the popular perception of taverns in the Shakespearean period, or almost in any period of the past, is as very rowdy and raucous places. Whenever you see an early modern pub depicted in a film or TV series, it's always everybody's extremely drunk, falling over each other. It's very rowdy, often very raunchy scenes, and this massively misrepresents the reality. There was a very clear set of behavioral expectations, a kind of etiquette to how you were supposed to behave when you went drinking, and this kind of etiquette collectively was known as good fellowship. And it had quite a clear set of kind of behavioral norms. Historians used to almost sort of lazily assume that people went to alehouses in pursuit of drunken oblivion, that life was difficult in this period, so you just went and got horribly drunk to kind of forget all your troubles. But actually, drunken oblivion wasn't what most people were doing. They were going to meet friends and develop relationships and cultivate friendships. And there was a certain expectation that you wouldn't just get horribly drunk, you would be good company and you would be cheerful and you would start sing songs and play games with your companions. And there was an expectation that you would drink, but still stay sort of sufficiently in control of yourself that you could participate in these kinds of activities. Contemporaries had a nice way of describing it. They would refer to being merry, which meant intoxicated, but in a way that made you cheerful and sociable. And they made a distinction between being merry on the one hand and being overcome with drink on the other. So being overcome with drink was when people had gone too far, ended up. And there's lots of examples of cases where people are obviously vomiting or defecating, losing control of their bodily functions, falling asleep, passing out in alehouses. And contemporaries always describe that as being overcome with drink. And it often comes with this associated shaming rituals. If you fall foul of this drinking too heavily, people that fall asleep in alehouses often have their codpieces untied and their private parts displayed as a kind of shaming ritual. there was an expectation that people would go and would drink fairly heavily, but it was the standard you were trying to achieve was to show you could drink and still stay reasonably orderly and in control. That said, the culture was kind of set up in such a way to constantly push that line. There were lots of drinking games and sort of competitive drinking games or songs that had verses that encouraged everyone to drink. So everyone was sort of, to be a good fellow meant you could sail as close as possible to that line between merry and overcome without sort of falling foul of becoming heavily drunk. Often the environment did spill over into being sort of rowdy and disorderly, but it was seen as shameful if you did end up in that state.
What kind of drinks would have been served inside the alehouses? Are Shakespeare's descriptions of small beer and wine accurate to what would have been available in a place like the Boar's Head Inn?
It kind of depends on the nature of the establishment. So historians sometimes we kind of group all inns, taverns, and alehouses all together under the kind of heading of pubs. But actually, contemporaries tended to make distinctions between inns and taverns, which are a bit more upmarket, and then alehouses, which are a bit more downmarket, if you like. So in a typical village alehouse, you wouldn't find your ordinary farmers and artisans drinking wine. But if you went to an inn, a kind of larger inn, or you went to a tavern in an urban environment, that's where you would find wine being served. So Shakespeare's representation is accurate for a place like the Boar's Head in London, which was an inn, which would have been serving a bit more of an upmarket clientele and would have had wine available, as well as beer. And again, the beer would depend a bit. Even a humble alehouse would have offered small beer, which was relatively low percentage alcohol, and people drank that pretty much like we drink tea and coffee today, kind of all day, every day. People were drinking small beer as a form of hydration and because it was more enjoyable than drinking water. But they also would have served strong beer as well, which was kind of the recreation stuff. So if you popped into an alehouse for some food and refreshment, then you might just have a small beer. But if you'd gone to drink with your friends and enjoy some good fellowship, then you might well have engaged in some strong beer. But really, in the 16th century, it's beers and wines are the main drinks. Spirits come much later.
So we wouldn't have found things like liquor or like whiskey or vodka or gin. These kinds of drinks wouldn't have been available at these establishments in Shakespeare's lifetime. No, very unlikely. I mean, people were consuming spirits in this period, but they tended to be consumed as medicine. So people took them for ailments rather than drinking them recreationally. That starts to change in the 17th century. And of course, by the early 18th century, with the gin craze, we see a massive kind of uptick in the consumption of liquor. But people weren't really drinking it for fun in the 16th century. I wonder about the concept of a physical bar where you walk up and get your beverage and then take it back to a table. Did that exist inside somewhere like the Boar's Head, or was it just tables and whatever you wanted to drink was brought to you? How did the physical situation work inside this establishment?
In this period, it would have been much more like the kind of restaurant style that you had your table and you called for drinks, and the alewife or a serving maid would come to your table to take your order and would then usually go to a buttery, so a store out the back where the drink would actually be stored, and they would pour it off and then bring it back to your tables. So that very classic English pub experience of going up to the bar to order a round of drinks comes in later centuries. It's not there in this period, which also kind of has interesting implications for the way people paid for their drinks, because you didn't go up to the bar to buy a round, you simply called for drinks. So at the end of the night, and of course this is still the case in restaurants and in many American bars as well, but you'd be presented with your bar bill at the end of the evening, or the score as people called it in the 16th, 17th centuries. And of course that often then led to a lot of wrangling, fallout over exactly who was supposed to pay what. Some people had left before the score was to be settled. So there was a whole rich vein of kind of contemporary commentary about people who snuck off before they'd paid their fair share of the shop. But all of that was a kind of consequence of the fact that you had table service rather than kind of pay as you go. And I think in some ways the development of kind of paying for your drink as you went to the bar was to try and kind of move on from the often quite complicated politics of payment that surrounded paying at the table.
You mentioned earlier that everyone would have had an alehouse that they went to or had gone into. And I wonder if this includes women. Would women have ever been customers of alehouses?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Shakespeare tends to present them as quite masculine environments, and that's not wrong. I think it's fair to say they were fairly masculine environments. A lot of this culture of good fellowship was certainly an expression of masculinity in the period, but they certainly weren't exclusively male spaces. There's a great study by historian Amanda Flather, who estimated from looking at court records that maybe 3 in every 10 alehouse customers were actually women. And there are a range of contexts in which it was seen as perfectly reasonable and respectable for women to go to alehouses. Courtship was one, especially if you lived in rural England in Shakespeare's time. There weren't lots of alternative spaces to go to meet somebody. So the youth of the parish, the young adults in the parish, it was seen as perfectly acceptable for them to go to alehouses to drink as part of kind of courtship processes. They couldn't go to a cinema or go bowling or whatever. Couples would go drinking together, and groups of women would go drinking, especially on market days. It was seen as a standard activity that a group of women, wives and widows, after going to market to sell their goods, might retire to a nearby inn or tavern to share a few drinks and to catch up. What was the context in which you don't really find women in alehouses is going alone, married or unmarried. Women didn't tend to go into alehouses on their own. They usually went either with a larger group of women or with alongside men. And whereas men were much freer to go in a kind of wider range of contexts. So yeah, women definitely participated in this alehouse culture in more constrained ways than men did, but it was part of their world as well, very much so.
Would theatergoers have been drinking ale from some of these taverns while they were watching a play at the Globe, for example, or at one of these more open air theater spaces where you're standing there? In my mind, I have them holding a mug of ale, but I'm not sure how accurate that is.
It's hard to tell exactly. I think it's extremely likely. There would have been establishments, especially in larger urban areas. You wouldn't have gone more than 4 or 5 houses down a street before you found an alehouse. I think one historian estimated that I think in Southampton in the 16th century, 1 in every 12 houses was an alehouse. So you would have had no problem finding a beer on the way to the theatre. But also it's very likely that there were hawkers who were going around in the crowd selling these kind of wares. There was a very strong kind of street food scene in London in particular in the 16th and 17th centuries already. And of course, outside of the kind of purpose-built theatres, a lot of people around the country would have seen plays by actually going to inns. Inn yards were one of the main performance spaces in provincial England. And of course, in those, the reason why those inns were hosting performances was to get people to come in and buy food and drink whilst they could then enjoy the performance. So it would have been quite a common experience for people to be drinking during plays. So I think that does put a different inflection on some of the scenes in taverns and alehouses in the plays, because some of the kind of jokes and the drinking that's taking place in the play would have been reflecting what was happening in the audience. So I think that is part of the dynamic, I think.
The ability to sort of, raise your glass and wink at the audience when you're
I'm
standing.
I'm sure there'd have been lots of scenes in Shakespeare where the audience were raising a toast and along with the
players. That's
absolutely.
That's fantastic. Would the theater goers have stayed at some of the inns mentioned in Shakespeare's plays on their way to London? I know Shakespeare, we've talked about the Boar's Head here, but he mentions, the White Hart and others across his works as well. Would these have been familiar to his audience? Was he doing that on purpose?
It's very likely. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of the specific establishments, whether people would have stayed at them. But I mean, part of the function of inns was they were essentially the hotels of their age. I mean, that was and this was also true for alehouses as well. That their principal function was supposed to be to provide refreshment and lodging for travellers. But then over time, they gradually came to serve local communities as well. So it would have been perfectly natural for people that were travelling to London. They would have been staying at inns on the way. So it would make sense to be name checking those, so that when they were then seeing the plays, they had that kind of recognition of that they themselves had a drink and spent a night in the places that were being mentioned in the plays. So inns were very much part of the kind of fabric of of everyday life and everyday travel. So anybody traveling anywhere in Shakespeare's England would have been stopping off at inns or alehouses along the way.
If you're excited to learn more about taverns and alehouses from Shakespeare's lifetime, I recommend checking out Mark's publication, Alehouses and Good Fellowship in Early Modern England. I will link to this for you in the show notes today. But Mark, from your work putting this research together, if we want to explore further into the history of alehouses and taverns and inns for Shakespeare's lifetime, what are some reliable resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
One classic study is Peter Clarke's The English Alehouse, A Social History, from 1200 to 1830, which was one of the first kind of pioneering study of drinking establishments and their history in England. Historians hadn't really taken them very seriously before Peter Clarke wrote his book in the 1980s, and a lot of research has been done since, but it's still a fantastic and very comprehensive guide to the history of drinking establishments. I'd also recommend Stephen Earnshaw's brilliant book, The Pub in Literature, England's Altered State, which again takes a kind of longer chronology, but he looks at the way the pub is dealt with in a range of literary traditions from Chaucer right through to the 20th century. But he has a whole chapter on Shakespeare's inns and taverns and representations of them. Steve's a fantastic writer, so that book's well worth a look too. And then there's also a fantastic website, the Intoxicants in Early Modern England project that was run by Phil Withington, which has digitized lots of primary sources. So there's court depositions and probate inventories and wills and court books and lots of material, primary sources that speak to the kind of day-to-day running and experiences of inns, alehouses and taverns in England. So if anyone's keen to kind of do their own primary research on this topic, then the Intoxicants database is a great resource.
Those are excellent resources, and I love a good historical database. Phil Withington has been a guest previously on our show and talks with us about not only intoxicants, but he shares a few funny 16th century drunk people stories. If you would like to check those out, I will link to that episode, all of these resources, and more about Mark and his work in the show notes. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Mark, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life. What's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
I tried to think of something clever to say, but the honest answer is I would probably take The Lord of the Rings. I've always been a Tolkien geek, and I think if I was stuck on a desert island, a kind of the classic epic tale of triumphing in the face of adversity, I think would probably be quite a helpful read to have whilst contemplating how to get off the island.
Yeah, I mean, maintaining your emotional well-being as well as having something entertaining on a desert island, I think all of that makes The Lord of the Rings an excellent choice for sure. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
So I'm currently writing a book about everyday life in 17th century villages, which tries to kind of draw together my past work on drinking culture, and also I've done a lot of research into the history of work, into an attempt to answer the slightly broader question of what would it actually have been like to live in a 17th century village. So that's the kind of question I've set myself, and I'm trying to draw on lots of court records to answer that question. And the nice twist that's making it particularly enjoyable is the main case study I'm using for the book is actually my hometown, which in the 17th century was a village, Portishead in Somerset. I found a lot of really great court cases that detail the kind of everyday lives of ordinary people from my hometown 400 years ago. So I'm trying to work those into this project as well. So that's my current project, and it's good fun having that personal connection to the.
It sounds really fun. And as much as we've enjoyed exploring your work looking into alehouses, I know we are all now very much looking forward to getting to visit a 17th century village through your work in the future. We'll look forward to seeing that come to life. Thank you so much, Mark Hailwood, for being here this week and taking us through the history of alehouses, inns, and taverns for Shakespeare's lifetime and helping us understand what those would have looked like when we see them mentioned from Shakespeare's stage. Thank you so much for being here this week.
Great. Thanks for having me.
If you'd like to add your voice to this conversation, you can comment on today's show inside our show notes. Not only will you find a place to leave your thoughts, but there's links to the resources our guest shares with you this week, along with links to Mark's latest book on alehouses and taverns in Shakespeare's lifetime. Find all of these resources at CassidyCash.com/episode 432. And don't forget to click the membership buttons while you're there to access bonus history content for today's show. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/EP432. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.